The international community has reviewed progress on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The verdict? Progress has been slow across all areas of climate action. To turn pledges into reality, governments and businesses must act quickly. This Climate Week, Newsweek will explore practical approaches that key economic sectors like energy, transportation, and industry are taking to invest in innovations aimed at reducing emissions and achieving net zero targets. Please join us in welcoming to the stage with a warm round of applause, Executive Vice President of Newsweek, Amit Shah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Newsweek's Sustainability Event of the Year, Pillars of Green Transition, which is being hosted for the first time as part of Climate Week. I am Amit Shah, the Executive Vice President of Newsweek. It's an honor to be here today, surrounded by so many influential figures shaping the global economy. Thank you all for being part of this exciting event. The green transition offers a path forward where economic growth, social equity, and environmental sustainability can go hand in hand for our better planet. I'm confident that the insights shared in this event will inspire action, spark new collaborations, and accelerate the momentum needed to meet our ambitious climate goals. With that, I want to express my deep gratitude to Climate Group and the event partners, Diamond sponsors Cytiva, Gold sponsors Bayer, and Silver sponsors Devinus Group, Tetra Pak, and RWE, and to all of you for here today, for your commitment to this vital cause. Together, let's build a green future that we know is possible. Thank you.
An eco-friendly fact about today's event: the printer we use to create the limited amount of printed collateral uses machinery that is some of the greenest in the country. They also use no VOC, recycle all of their own chemistry in-house, dump zero water, and their inks are 40 to 60% vegetable-based. For today's first fireside chat, please welcome to the stage President of Genomic Medicine and Head of Sustainability at Cytiva, Emmanuel Abbat. And today's moderator, Newsweek Environmental Sustainability and Governance Editor, Jeff Young.
Emmanuel, thank you so much.
Jeff, good to see you.
Yeah. Well, so thanks very much for being here. We're going to dive into some interesting topics today, especially the notion of how we get our hands around the full scope of emissions from business activity. And I know this is something you've been deeply engaged with and have given a lot of thought to. Sure. But let's start big picture. Give me a sense of your industry sector as a whole, biopharma. What scale of emissions are we talking about, and how can we put that in terms that people can relate to?
Sure. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. Maybe just a quick word of Cytiva and why I think we're trying to be relevant in that conversation. But Cytiva is one of the 3 or 4 big supplier of biomanufacturing solutions. So think about making monoclonal antibodies or cell therapy. We provide the manufacturing chain, right? And we sit right in the middle of that biopharma ecosystem. We have 25 plants around the world. So a nice global presence that I think give us a good sense of the challenges that the biopharma industry faces with sustainability. And I think something that is fairly unique to our industry is like, look, we're not petrochemicals, right? We're not one of the big massive emitters, but we have specific challenge. Single-use plastics, for instance, is one that are critical to making drugs, and so how we address it. And interestingly, if you look at our footprint, the footprint of this industry, look, our plants are relatively small, are not necessarily super heavy from an emission standpoint, but our supply chain is complex, is very diverse, is very spread out. We rely enormously on air freight, for instance. So I think there is complexity in the sense that you can tackle what you look at your plants and you work on them, and that's okay. That maybe you address 10 or 15% of the problem. The rest is spread out enormously, and that's the main challenge for our industry.
Clearly. And so you've touched on this, but where do you find the bulk of emissions arise?
Yeah.
You've mentioned the supply chain. What are we talking about?
So if I break it down in big pieces, I would say our Scope 1 and 2, so what we buy and emit, probably 15% of our emission. Then another 15 to 20% is transportation, logistic, air freight, right? And the rest, 60%, is our supply base, our suppliers, the material they use, and that's sort of the big pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are your options there? If 15% is transport.
Yeah.
What are your options for bringing emissions down?
Yeah, I think we once we've addressed our industrial footprint, the next big thing is moving from air to land or air to boat. We call it airless. That's the program we've been driving at Cytiva, which is challenging in and of itself because it's a profound reconsideration of our supply chain. Where do you hold inventories? We have products that are very fragile, very strict cold chain. So how do you manage that when you shift modes of transport? So there is a whole story here to be addressed. That is not something that you solve just like that in a matter of months. You need to work with your supplier, with your customers, and transform the business model. The other big chapter for us is what we call sustainable by design, and how do you rethink your products from the start? Okay, now what's important to understand is for us, changing a single-use bags that is used to make vaccines might seem easy, but when you start doing that, you need to address complete requalification with the FDA because that material touches the drug substance or the drug product. So again, it's a significant regulatory effort that you need to do with customers. And so I think what's relatively unique to our industry is that 60% of what we emit, in order to solve it, you need to work hand in hand with your supplier and customers to do that together. It's really a collective effort.
This obviously implies a high degree of collaboration.
Yep.
Talk to me about how do you do that? How do you communicate up along the supply chain to try to achieve reductions?
So I think it's a mix of top down. All right, so we got to do it, and frankly, I think if I look at the large pharma or biggest customers, they've been very committal to net zero and targets. So at some point, they're like, this is got to be table stake, and so they put pressure through the whole ecosystem. So that's one way to do it. But I think also, what's interesting is how do you help, in particular, your suppliers get better. Okay, so it's one thing to push down your target and your metric and your expectation, and ultimately maybe use it as a way to select who you want to work with. But I think what we're also trying to do is like, okay, how do we get better together? Because my footprint is your footprint in a way, right? So how do we sit around the table? And if I take air shipment, and we've had some good stories with some of our large customers where we've transferred some of our shipments from air to sea or air to rail. And at the end of the day, it's about shared commitment and shared interest. And I think it changes the level of the conversation, right? It's really about doing something together that is outside of the normal course of business. And frankly, I think it creates a level of intimacy between partners that I've not seen prior to leading sustainability.
Interesting. So I'm wondering, do you realize other benefits aside from the sustainability goals that you've set out with these collaborative conversations? Are you finding that in that process you're getting other benefits from that?
And it's I think we commissioned a survey 6 months ago. We interviewed 800 of the biopharma players to understand their commitments to sustainability, the progress they are making, etc. And interestingly, there is a correlation, I don't know if it's a causality, but a correlation between those that would call the leaders in the space and those that have good business performance. Okay, and I think it sort of makes sense, right? Because at the end of the day, at least when you start sustainability, frankly, it's about good practices. ISO 14001 is about how you run the plant in the right way. Looking for emission savings, it's about waste management, it's about lean, it's about doing things in the right way. So I'd say, when you get a program started, at first we're like, well, it's going to be a big cost burden to the business. And there is no question that you add cost at some point. But when you get started, you have savings. You have savings automatically. I mean, you switch off the light, you save, right? And in years of high energy cost, like we've seen the past couple of years, where there is savings. So, I think very often we say, well, we're not going to get started because it's too expensive. The reality is if you start early, and at least the first couple of years and the first, let's say, 20, 30% come with significant economic savings. It's about good business practices, right?
And do you find that you're driving change up the supply chain? And is that through collaboration or sometimes through, I don't want to say coercion, but
yeah, we do.
You have some sway in this relationship.
No, we do. We're not exerting coercion yet, right? And I think, let's be clear, there is any supplier here. We're not, so we don't. But I think. Look, there is interest, but it's not easy, right? Getting started, finding, and especially when I talk about, everybody can switch to renewable electricity, mapping your supply chain. We started a massive effort 18 months ago where we're doing, data gathering through our entire supply chain. 18 months into it, we're I'd say 30 or 40% done, okay? And so there is, if you want to get to the end of it, it's a long-term, sustained effort, okay? And again, it's something that we do it with our suppliers, right? Helping do it, doing it help them do it as well, right? So I think again, it's really about collaborative effort. So we're not being too coercive at this point. At some point we will. I think at some point we will. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So you've touched on this, but as a consumer, and I think for most of us, the way we interact with the medical community and medical settings, something I'm always struck by is that thing you mentioned about single-use plastics, especially. Yeah. How do you tackle that? Because I understand they're essential.
They're essential.
To
no single-use plastic, no COVID vaccine. Let's be very clear, right? And no gene therapy, and no monoclonal antibodies, and no nothing, right? And on top of that, we used to produce all these drugs in steel, and what we've come to realize is that the total footprint of using single-use is actually smaller than using steel that you need to have to wash and rewash, etc. So
because of the energy and
because of the energy you save, right? So it is the best possible way to do it, even from an environmental footprint, but it still has a footprint. So how do we do it? Look, I think solving for plastic is a UN magnitude effort, right? It's huge. So, we do it step by step. The first thing we do is we offer a recycling option to our customers, okay? Let's take them back. Let's make something useful out of it. We partner with leading universities to try to find, enzymes that can degrade those plastics. So, I think a lot of it is, frankly, science is still to be invented. So we're trying to be pragmatic and offer recycling options. And then we're investing with partners to try to define the next generation of plastics, right?
So we have just about a minute left and put you on the spot a little bit. But if you have to really quickly summarize, what's the secret to really driving change on this issue?
I think it starts with commitment, and we're very, very clear. You have to commit externally, right? That's the driving force. So Cytiva and Danaher are net zero commit also. It starts there, right? And then you drive engagement and culture change through the organization. It is contagious. And when I started 5 years ago, in a good way, when I started 5 years ago, there was 100 people. Now we have thousands of people that are engaged. It brings meaningful change. It helps attract talent. It's fun. Sometimes we go to a plant and we spend a week. We call that a Kaizen, and we do end-to-end, and we clean the plant, right? And you come with tangible effort, right? But you got to commit. You got to commit externally. I think that's where it starts, and then you drive the culture through shared success and collective effort, right?
Well, I think that's our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Can we round of applause, please?
Thank you.
For our next fireside chat, please welcome to the stage Vice President of Business Development, Bayer Ecosystem Services, Max Doherty.
Thanks so much, Max.
Yes, indeed. Great to see you.
Yep. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and go from the world of biopharma to the world of agriculture. So again, I think we're going to take a similar approach and start big picture on this. If you can just sort of give us the 10,000-foot view, what's at stake when we're talking about emissions from our food systems, from agriculture?
It's a great place to start because when we take a step back and think about what's really at stake, ultimately society's expectations of food and agriculture are evolving. I mean, we're faced with tackling two of the greatest challenges facing society of our time, food security and climate change. And so the question is, how can we continue to feed a growing planet of 10 billion people by 2050, while at the same time recognizing that how we feed ourselves, agri-food in general, can account for up to a quarter to a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so what's at stake is embracing that challenge, Jeff, and ultimately tackling feeding a growing planet while nurturing the environment on which we all rely. And what we're really excited about is that we believe that regenerative agriculture can be a critical solution to doing just that.
So break this down for me. What are we talking about with regenerative agriculture, and how does that help us with this emissions problem?
Well, regenerative agriculture to us is defined around four principles. The first is, how can we augment the production system such that we continue to make farmers productive and profitable? Secondly, how can we actually mitigate climate change? And then third, how can we restore the rest of the environmental attributes that are associated with the system? And so we at Bayer are advancing technologies, products, and services that can deliver on each of those outcomes: productivity, profitability, climate mitigation, as well as restoring the rest of the ecosystem. And that for us is what matters, the outcomes rather than the nuances of the definitions.
Okay. So in general practice, though, or specific practice, we're talking about things like no-till, use of cover crops, things like that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly correct. Those are two wonderful examples. Cover crop and no-till are practices that really, they can help farmers not only over the long term improve the productivity and resilience of their operation, but also by keeping that soil covered throughout the season, actually take carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it into the soil through the plants, as well as the cover crops, as well as the cash crops that they're growing throughout the season, by not disturbing that soil and allowing the carbon to come back out into the atmosphere.
So this is what I find exciting here, because we're not just talking about, oh, let's make this less bad, less emissions. We're also talking about, let's flip this around and make this a solution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you take a look at the potential climate mitigation capacity that agriculture as a system possesses, it's absolutely tremendous. I mean, a recent study from the IPCC demonstrated that agriculture itself has the opportunity to mitigate up to 2 gigatons of CO2 and climate impact. And that isn't even really looking at the full potential and scale of leveraging regenerative practices to sequester carbon into the soil. So it's really a tremendous opportunity to, again, tackle these two mega challenges of how do we continue to feed a growing planet of 10 billion people by 2050, while at the same time regenerating the ecosystems.
So this sounds great from the high view, but farmers operate literally at the ground view, at the soil level view. Is this a tough sell to get them to change practices? Because in my experience with farmers, they know what they do, and they do what they do, and they don't really like change that much. How do you engage them in doing something new, something different?
Look, I hear you loud and clear. I hear it on my own family farm in southwestern Iowa. there are significant operational, agronomic, and economic considerations that come with how you integrate regenerative farming practices into your operation. Like it's challenging. These things don't happen in a vacuum. You have to partner with these small businesses, which it's important to remember, farmers are small businesses, to make it work for them, agronomically and economically. And so for us, Jeff, I mean, to your question of like, what does that look like? I mean, our approach boils down to this. First and foremost, we keep the farmer at the center of everything we do, and then we make sure to meet them with a collection of agronomic support and services, ways in which we can reduce barriers to adoption of regenerative farming practices. So at Bayer, we facilitate an entire ecosystem of products and services providers that offer regenerative solutions to growers to make it easier for them to adopt. So whether that be discounts on cover crop seeds, discounts on things like no-till planting equipment, that's a critical element of the equation. But then also financial incentives, right? These practices, they come with costs, and they come with upfront risks and challenges. And so we want to bring that confluence of solutions together to make it possible for them.
I see. So we're focusing a lot here today on the scope 3, the supply chain, the upstream of everyone. It's hard to think of something that is more upstream than agriculture. I mean, agriculture provides so many ingredients, materials. So how does this factor into this scope 3 challenge, the kind of things that you're doing, the kind of partnerships that you're making with farmers?
Absolutely. So at Bayer, we are developing an ecosystem services business, which is really, you can think of it as a two-sided marketplace. On one side of the marketplace, we're working closely with farmers, as we've been talking about, providing them with the agronomic support to help them progress along their regenerative journey. And when we do that, we can actually collect the data and evidence to clearly document and securitize the carbon benefit that is occurring on their farm. Now, as you said, Jeff, those farmers are sitting upstream of a variety of entities, whether it be food manufacturers, biofuel producers, you name it. And so on the other side of our business model, we're actually serving as the arbiter to connect companies that are downstream in that value chain to help fund those interventions that farmers are putting in place so that then they also ultimately can secure and absorb that carbon benefit into their scope 3 and report out to their various customers and stakeholders on how they're investing in climate action in a very tangible way in their supply chain.
So let's drill down on this a little bit, because this implies an ability to really measure the carbon benefit that you're achieving through these practices. How do you do that with when you're talking about fields of crops?
Absolutely. So we have invested aggressively in developing digital solutions that actually just help farmers farm more productively and efficiently by managing, analyzing, and acting on the data in their operation. Now, what's been great about building that infrastructure over the last decade is it's not only helping farmers now be more productive, but it's actually also, it's created the infrastructure for capturing rigorously the on-field primary data of their operational information, the agronomic information, even evidence relating to, did a grower actually implement a specific intervention that is creating the carbon benefit? So we take a very rigorous approach to how we're collecting the data and the evidence, and then following the leading standards and methodologies for how we translate the data and evidence related to the interventions on the farm into carbon outcomes that can ultimately be securitized into these scope 3 assets, or even low carbon products, like we'll talk about with our partner Purdue Farms, who is here as well.
And so this is allows them to participate in carbon markets?
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
So talk to me a little about the state of carbon markets. We've got about a minute and a half. It's been some people call it a Wild West kind of area. A lot of questions about how we verify the carbon benefits from that people are paying for with their carbon credits. What's your read on the status of that?
Bayer's a 150-year-old business with core operations in pharmaceuticals, consumer health, and agriculture. And our reputation, as well as the reputation of our customers, is of utmost importance to us in this space. And so for us, we have been highly involved in making sure that we're collaborating with the leading standard and methodology bodies that I think are really beginning to bring a common language and overall approach to how we approach carbon markets generally. So whether it's in calculations, whether it's in establishing topics like additionality, what if the change occurred? There's, I think, some really important leading work happening in that space right now that we're staying very close to. Because at the end of the day, there needs to be a high level of rigor if there's going to be credibility, and there needs to be credibility if this is ultimately going to be a successful business model.
And really quickly, just to close out, I know you grew up in a farming area, farming family, right?
Correct.
Are farmers excited about being part of climate solutions?
Look, I was talking with a farmer last week, and he told me this wonderful story. He's been adopting these regenerative farming practices for now the last 6 or 7 years. He's based in western Minnesota, and 3 years ago there was a drought that hit his area. They only got, he was telling me, he tracks the rainfall. 50% of the rainfall that they normally get in a given year. Now, the growers around him, they lost up to a third of their crop. Yet this farmer, because he had been implementing these regenerative practices, cultivating the soil health, ensuring that there's a high level of water absorption capacity, managed to stay on and produce his highest yield ever. And so that's just one success story, but it's the story of resilience. And it's a story of how regenerative farming can ultimately push the frontier of productivity into the future. And I think as more and more growers are learning about that and learning about the ways in which companies like Bayer can collaborate with them, we're only going to continue to see excitement grow, even despite there are, as I said, challenges with integrating the system in the early days.
That's a great example, and we'll stop our conversation there. A round of applause for Max. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Our events caterer works to be extremely environmentally friendly. They compost, donate to food banks across New York City, participate in advanced recycling programs, and use biodegradable serveware, including the coffee and cappuccino cups you use today. And now, please welcome to the stage an experienced leader on international climate and humanitarian issues with over 20 years in government and corporate engagement, Climate Group CEO, Helen Clarkson.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm Helen Clarkson, Chief Exec of Climate Group, and it's great to be at the Pillars of the Green Transition event with Newsweek, who is one of our key partners for Climate Week NYC. Hopefully by now, it's Wednesday, you know what Climate Week NYC is. You're all at a Climate Week event. Some of you who've been around have seen my face and heard my voice a bit too much at this point, because it's been a big week for Climate Group. We're the organisation that puts on Climate Week NYC every year, our own events, but also curate the week. And this year there's 900 events that are taking part as part of Climate Week NYC, of which this is one. Hooray! When we're not doing that, we work with some of the largest companies in the world to speed up the transition. And what we do is we drive demand for sustainable solutions in systems where we can have the biggest impact, so energy, transport, heavy industry, and food. And every year at Climate Week NYC, we work to bring together decision makers from these sectors, but also the world of politics, tech, civil society, academia, and others to drive climate action fast, which is our mission. And this year, and every year, we think of a theme, we think about where we are in terms of the climate crisis. And this year, the theme, and the things you'll have heard us saying a lot, is it's time. And we've defined that in lots of ways. But the reason we want to say that and say it's time, and what we mean by that, is there are lots of 2030 and 2050 commitments out there. And they're really, really critical. You need to be setting those long-term targets to drive action. But if you set a 2050 target, you can't just say, oh, yeah, we've got a 2050 target. I'll get right on that in 2049. We need to be starting right now. And again, that's something we say to companies, but we also said to ourselves, okay, let's challenge ourselves to come up with a list of specific actions. And so we launched on Sunday a global to-do list of 7 actions that we can start taking right now by next year that will drive us on the track to 2030. Now, I'm not going to go through all 7. That's not just because I can't remember, I can do it just about, but I really wanted to focus in on a few. So one of them is about renewables. We talk about renewables a lot. What we found through our work is that the biggest barriers to renewable deployment are regulatory. They're the regulations, siting, permitting issues that come up in certain countries, well, lots of different markets. So the amount of time it takes you to get your renewables onto the grid, that's not driven by the manufacturing time of renewables. That's pretty quick. It's all to do with how quickly you can get your regulations and permits. So we really need to start driving after those regulatory changes right now. On energy efficiency, last year at COP28, you know, the big climate conference every year, there was an agreement that we would double energy efficiency by 2030. Almost nothing has happened with regard to that. It was one of those things that everyone's like, yep, definitely got to do that. Really hope they do that. Good luck. And no one's really doing it themselves. So we're asking every organization to set a target of energy efficiency of 5% per annum. We've got to start looking on how we drive down the energy we use. We've got other actions around methane, so asking for a global body on methane that really has the power to audit that, and also actions around fossil fuels. So I encourage you to go and look at the video. You'll get to see more of me on that, talking about those 7 actions and thinking about how you can take them back into your organizations, because it's clear that we can't waste another year. And that work needs to happen whichever sector you're in. And that we're going to hear this afternoon from, you know, food, pharmaceuticals. Those are the sort of actions that really are the pillars of the green transition. And so with that, I urge you to kind of approach the conversation this afternoon with those ideas in mind and thinking about what can you do when you leave this room? What are you learning from either me quickly talking or the panels you're going to hear? Because we need to innovate, collaborate, and we've got to treat this crisis with urgency. It's time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Helen for that informative content. Another interesting climate-focused fact about this event, you'll see the space is dotted with orchids. Orchids were chosen today as they are extremely environmentally friendly. They constitute a significant portion of the plant diversity in rainforest and contribute to the health of these ecosystems by providing food and shelter for diverse animals and microbes. In addition, my orchids can bloom for weeks or even years with proper care, which means that fewer new purchases and less waste overall. And now please join us in welcoming today's panelists, several of whom you already know. Today's moderator and Newsweek Environmental Sustainability Governance Editor, Jeff Young. Vice President of Business Development, Bayer Ecosystem Services, Max Doherty. Chairman of Divines Group, David Bellotti. Vice President of Climate and Biodiversity, Tetra Pak, Gilles Tisserand. Vice President of Agriculture Services, Purdue Agribusiness LLC, Scott A. Raubenstein. Co-founder and Chief Science Officer of 12, Dr. Itasha Cave.
So I'm really excited about this conversation because we have a busy stage, and that means we have a real diversity of industry perspectives here, people in different lines of work, but with, I'm sure we'll discover here, some commonalities and some cross-cutting themes and common challenges that you're all tackling. I want to start, though, just again, to give us a sense of the problem that we're up against, with an estimate of how much of your emissions you think come from this Scope 3 area. We're talking about along the value chain, the supply chain upstream, the end life of the products downstream. And coming to you first, Max, on the end, do we have a rough number on that?
Yeah, we do. At Bayer, we believe a better world is possible through science and innovation. So for us, that means taking a scientifically rigorous approach to climate action. And so we've aligned with the science-based targets to set near-term, interim, as well as long-term goals. And for us, as we take a look at our total climate footprint, we're actually really excited to say we're on track to hit our 2024 goals, which is reducing our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 20%. as well as our Scope 3 emissions by 6%, and are similarly on track to ultimately hit our 2029 goal of reducing our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 42%, and also then Scope 3 by 12%. Now, in terms of the total footprint, we have about 3/4 of our greenhouse gas footprint that is in Scope 3. So to your point, it's an absolute critical area of emphasis for us.
Well, thank you. And David, what are we looking at in terms of Scope 3 emissions with your company?
95%. So we are done with the Scope 1 and Scope 2. We neutralized it already many years ago. Now, when it comes to Scope 3, this is the big challenge. Scope 3 is all about collaboration. It's about radical interdependence. As a B Corp, we have this culture of radical interdependence and collective solutions. So, of course, upstreams, downstreams, I think we'll talk about that, will make a difference, and you need to have several strategies to bring it down. We have the goal of going 55% less by 2030.
Mm-hmm. So the bulk is still clearly in this Scope 3 area. Yeah. Okay.
Big time.
And Gilles, what are we looking at there?
Yeah, I like the question. In the case of Tetra Pak, it's actually pretty close to what I've heard from my colleagues around the table, right? It's actually 99%. It's not a ballpark figure. It's measured, audited.
So pretty much all of it.
Yeah, 99% of our footprint is in our Scope 3. Two main reasons about that. First of all, because we have drastically reduced our Scope 1 and 2, so what happens within our operations, right? But also because we have a very wide portfolio of solutions, not only packaging, but processing, which means that when you look at those 99%, pretty much 50% comes from upstream, the materials that we buy, and then the remaining 49% comes from the downstream piece, which is the impact of our solutions on the ground. Once I said that, another data that you need to have in mind when it comes to Tetra Pak, we actually have reduced our Scope 1, 2, and 3 by 20% in the past 4 years. How? Engaging our suppliers for the upstream part, critical, and we have the power, the leverage, the responsibility to engage the upstream part. But the downstream part is related to the product, how we design what we decide to sell. And that's also where we have made, I would say, massive, important choices on deciding what to sell and give to our customers so that they can also reduce their Scope 3 and Scope 1, 2, and 3, 1 and 2. So it's all about the value chain. So 99%, but heavily reducing, so we can do it.
Thank you. Scott, same question. Looking at Scope 3, what are we talking about?
Thank you very much. And at Purdue Agribusiness, we are the grain origination side of the Purdue Farms business that produces billions of pounds of chicken every year. And so we have a very complex supply chain, a very compact supply chain, but we're dealing with over 6,500 farmers in the Northeast, and we're dealing with 22,000 associates, and we produce billions of pounds of chicken every year. And so when we take a look at climate action, we recognize that 70% of the Scope 3 is from the seed that we drop in the ground to produce the grain, all the way through our manufacturing processes to produce the feed. So we're really targeted at understanding what our footprints are on the products that we produce, and we want to be those responsible stewards to produce the most economical protein, and we'd like to lead those conversations. So we're really taking a look at that baseline. Where can we implement climate interventions and make a difference?
Itasha?
Yeah, so I'm a co-founder at 12, and we are in our early stages of scaling up. So, and we also are based in California, so a lot of our Scope 2 emissions are covered by the infrastructure where we can purchase clean electricity. So the vast majority of our emissions are from Scope 3. But the way that we look at Scope 3 emissions at 12 is that we are developing technology that would actually address Scope 3 emissions. So we make sustainable aviation fuel from carbon dioxide. So instead of taking carbon out of the ground in terms of fossil fuels, you can take it from the air and use our technology and electricity to convert that CO2 into sustainable aviation fuel. And aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors, is majority of Scope 3 emissions. And so we look forward to having a world where all of these companies up here can be able to have a sustainable option for their flight and shipping and transportation.
Well, we'll dive into that a little more deeply in just a little bit. Thank you for that. So, David, I want to go back to you because I think this week your company used Climate Week as an opportunity to launch your sustainability goals for 2030. I want to hear a little more about that, and specifically on this issue of the Scope 3, because it's so much of what we have to deal with.
Yeah, we have, let's say, an organic strategy, 4 pillars: decarbonization, because it's the mother of all the different consequences of global warming. Then we have circularity, biodiversity, and water. Those are the four big pillars. One, let's say, ambitious goal that we have, moral ambitious goal that we have, is to keep on growing the company, because the company is for the last 30 years always had a organic, constant growth, but decouple the growth with the CO2 emission per unit of product sold. And it seems counterintuitive, it seems impossible to reach, but actually we see the possibility through dozens of different projects. For example, on decarbonization only, we have 28 different projects that are embedded in the business model, and of course they have to be approved by the CFO and the business plan that will come in the future years. But yes, it's possible to be able to decouple the growth and therefore deserve a growth that we think can only be sustainable. That's the only right to grow has to be decoupled from CO2 emissions.
So part of what I find appealing about what you just described is that you're focusing on emissions, but you're also doing it within the context of focusing on these other challenges that we have to meet: biodiversity, water use. I think sometimes we tend to get what I call carbon blinders on, where we're so focused on one aspect of the sustainability challenge that we risk losing sight of things like this massive biodiversity crisis. Clearly, all these things are very interconnected. Tell me about how that notion of interconnectedness affects your approach to this.
Well, first we need to recognize some very basic principles. For example, that the planet is only one living organism, one breathing organism, like James Lovelock or other scientists say that. So radical interdependency means that every single action, every single input has a consequence at the planetary level, at the general law of science that regulates the planet. So when you work on as B Corp, you learn how to measure your impact. You learn about to do a materiality analysis and check all the different impact that you have, and then radical interdependence comes out, and you realize that you have to work on circularity. And biodiversity is because upstream, in order to tackle Scope 3, we have a big project on regenerative organic agriculture, and particularly 80 ingredients that will produce through these regenerative organic practices to reduce our CO2 emission, and biodiversity is linked to that. Then circularity, of course, it's about packaging and all the different end of life of the packaging after very strict eco-design principles. And for every single type of packaging that you use, aluminum, cardboard, glass, plastic, we have specific targets for specific material.
Well, we'll definitely return to that concept of circularity in just a moment, but I want to stick on this notion of the interconnectedness of these different challenges that we're facing. And Scott, question for you, sir. It's because it's really hard to think of a line of work other than agriculture and farming where this interconnectedness is more present. You can't ignore water if you're a farmer. You can't ignore biodiversity. So again, tell me how that informs your thinking, your company's approach to tackling emissions.
Yeah, it's a really great question and a very important one at that. In taking a look at our farmers upstream, super critical in the production of grain to feed our chickens, and then looking at our consumers and our companies that we work with every day to invite them to join in our supply chain and in our efforts to make climate impact a real possibility. And we think by inviting other supply chains, working within our supply chain, and really supporting our farmers to produce the highest quality grain, and we feel that a higher quality grain and feed will produce a better tasting chicken. And so we want to bring that traceability, we want to bring that collaboration, and look at it a little differently from a supply chain perspective. We'd like to invite other supply chains within our supply chains to provide that full traceability from seed to fork. And we think that's a really viable option.
So you have a partnership with Max down here and the good folks at Bayer. Tell me about how that is helping you achieve these goals.
Yeah, a really great partnership with Max and Bayer. And one of the things that we couldn't do at Purdue is have the digital ecosystem that Bayer brings to the table. They're on over 200 million acres globally and bring a real great digital expertise so that we can track the data that we need to provide the data and the support and the verification through the development of grain and understanding the importance of having a farmer be profitable and sustainable and utilizing methods to ensure that there's longevity with our soils is super critical, especially when you're feeding chickens and relying on high quality grain. So we thank Bayer for the partnership, and we look forward to continuing to grow on the upstream, and then we have partnerships on the downstream as well in terms of working directly with the consumers to understand food waste, how they're cooking, the chicken that they're producing, and ensuring that we can provide that visibility on our climate action.
So Max, a natural follow-up for you in this partnership. How are you taking what you're learning from that and putting it to work elsewhere?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we're learning as we continue to engage with Purdue and collaborate with farmers in their grain ecosystem is that these regenerative farming practices, while they can deliver very clear impacts with respect to emission reductions by eliminating the need for energy-intensive tillage passes, or also create meaningful, tangible carbon benefits in terms of sequestering carbon into the soil, that's really great. But there are also significant benefits that we're seeing in terms of improvements in terms of water usage and conservation, improvements in terms of how protecting and nurturing those soils can prevent things like nutrient runoff, or frankly even necessitate less synthetic nutrient use because you're cultivating healthy soil. We're seeing other benefits related to, as you said, around biodiversity. And so I think for us, as we really focus on partnering with Purdue in their upstream farmer supply shed, which for us at Bayer, our entire business is predicated on how can we serve and support and make farmers more productive and profitable. We're expanding the aperture on what that could look like in other regions in the United States and even around the world.
Super. Is there something on the horizon that the two of you are especially excited about when you look at climate solutions in the, pardon the pun, agriculture field here?
I think it's really important that we work together and bring a like-minded community together. There are many farmers that are implementing regenerative practices very successfully and have really resilient soils that stabilize yield, that keep soil where it's supposed to be, and a living biomass above and below ground at all times. And so we can bring that like-minded community together and leverage both of our brands to then communicate and help other farmers convert. And we think we can scale that with our combination, our collaboration as well. Max?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would add is we've talked a lot thus far about the role of regenerative farming practices, which is absolutely critical for protecting the soil and continuing to cultivate a healthy ecosystem. But I think as we look a little bit further down the road, there's another horizon of potential impact that will occur from actually creating novel products in the agricultural system that will be able to deliver the same level of productivity and profitability for growers, but at the same time continue to lower the environmental footprint. So for example, for us, we're in the midst of launching our Preceon Smart Corn system. These are short stature corn hybrids that yield well, are resilient and stable, but now allow farmers to get into the field because the corn plant's this high instead of this high, all throughout the year, which means they can approach nutrient application more precisely. They can approach crop protection application more precisely. And so I think this future vision of how we bring together practices like no-till, cover crop, nitrogen efficiency with new products like seed and genetics, what we're developing, is going to unlock a completely new frontier of opportunity and innovation.
So when it comes to corn, bigger isn't necessarily better? The shorter corn might be a better option?
Yeah. The ears, the grain, will be just as big, if not bigger, but now a shorter stature plant that has more resilience to wind events, because look at how much crop is lost in the field every year due to inclement weather, as well as allows for more precise and efficient management of inputs, which, as we all know, inputs are a significant element of the total carbon footprint that agriculture has.
Gilles, your company clearly is concerned with something that David mentioned earlier, and that is looking at packaging. It's right there in the name, pack. Talk to me a bit about how you're tackling that.
Yeah, actually I love that discussion because finally we are talking about food and the food systems transformation that needs to happen. Tetra Pak is in the business of making food safe and available everywhere. Our solutions are sold in 180 countries, and our job is to ensure that what Scott and his peers eventually are getting processed and packaged in the right way so that people, consumers, you and me in the room, can consume it. That's also true in Africa, in Asia. And that's where actually packaging plays an important role, because the primary role of Tetra Pak packaging is to protect highly perishable food. And that's where, again, kicks in technology, aseptic technology and aseptic packaging, because using that technology, you're able to give a longer shelf life to a product which is highly perishable. There are studies showing actually that if you extend the shelf life of dairy by 1 week, you actually reduce the waste by 30%. And I would like every people in the room to remember one figure today. 1/3 of the food which is grown, transformed, is wasted. So when we talk about food security, of course we need to bring efficiency everywhere in that value chain. That starts in growing better seeds and food, but that also starts by packaging, processing food the right way. Now that I've mentioned this, of course, there's a high responsibility in designing the right pack. So at Tetra Pak, we look, of course, at product design, so the upstream part. What is the material that we want to bring into our package? It must be low carbon. Actually, we have reduced the carbon footprint of the material that we are sourcing by 20% in the past 4 years. We've made choices to move away, part of our portfolio for now, move away from fossil-based plastic to plant-based plastic, because it brings minus 20% CO2 footprint. So that's one example of what we are working on, right? And you need to think about the impact of your product downstream, end of life, and our packaging are designed to be recycled. Actually, we are investing every year more or less 40 million euros ourselves to develop that value chain, working also on technology to ensure that the materials get a new life. So that's that whole circularity in terms of mindset that we have to have as a company. And that's what we are applying here in the US, but also in the 180 countries that we are selling our products.
So you have touched on this, but I want to get into this in a bit more detail, and that is the use of plastics in packaging. I'm having in mind here the ongoing United Nations talks for a plastics treaty, which we might get by the end of this year, who knows. How are you thinking about that, and how might the outcome of that influence your company's practices?
Yeah, I think it's super important to follow what's going on at the UN, on the UN Plastic Treaty, because it's going to have an impact on all of us, companies and citizens. And at Tetra Pak, we welcome such type of initiatives. I think it's important to realize the impact that plastic has when it's poorly sourced and poorly handled in the end of life. One of the points with this UN Plastic Treaty is to look into recycling and to ensure that every type of packaging, every type of plastic actually get properly recycled. So one of the points of discussion is to establish extended producer responsibility, so to ensure that every people in that value chain, starting by the brand owners, participate to the financing of the creation of a recycling stream. And for us at Tetra Pak, we are not a plastic packaging, even if we happen to have a little bit of plastic in our pack. So for us, it's very important to be part of a discussion and ensure that every type of packaging is part of the EPR system, as we call it, because we've seen how successful it's been in countries where it is applied. You've heard I'm French, so I've experienced EPR for years now, and we've seen how it has enabled countries and then the society to increase drastically the recycling of plastics or beverage cartons. So I think it's a very important discussion that is happening right now at the UN.
And David, I imagine you're keeping an eye on that as well when you think about packaging for products. Same question to you. Do you see the UN treaty perhaps having a big impact?
Yeah, on plastic, we have a goal by 2030 to have at least no more than 10% of virgin plastic on our products, 90% recycled. At the moment, we are 65% recycled. It's true that plastic is more challenging. That when you have a glass, paper, or aluminum, you can have more than 90% recycled. The most virtuous countries can be above 90%, but in plastic it's difficult to be above 60 or 65% on recycling. What we do in Davin is for every single piece of plastic that comes out of our factory, we take back the same amount from ocean plastic or social plastic in countries that don't have a good end-of-life infrastructure, like Philippines, Thailand, Brazil, and Indonesia. So if here we are the smallest company out there, but we value very much our role of being influencers, of inspiring other companies that if they could do this, what we do, the world would be in a much better place. For example, we collaborate with Plastic Bank, and we calculated our plastic leakage is around 10-15%. Our products are in around 90 countries, and we know that in 15-20 countries, the end of life is very critical, especially Southeast Asia and Latin America. So, but we don't stop at our 15% plastic leakage when it comes to compensation. We go 100%. So it's. I think we make our contribution. It would be nice if bigger companies could do the same with Plastic Bank or with some other organizations. Up to the moment where there will be a better solution than plastic, because, for example, in the beauty industry, because of also the reason that were mentioned before, it's very hard to substitute plastic with aluminum or glass, and actually the footprint of plastic is still the least worst.
Thank you. Gilles, back to you for another question. And I think consumers encounter you and your company via the packaging and associate you with packaging. But there's more to the company than that, obviously. And you're also very involved upstream with the manufacturing of food products, correct?
Yeah.
How does that play into this question that we're thinking about of supply chains and emissions from supply chains?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, of course, Tetra Pak in the name has packaging in it, right? And that's actually how the company started 70 years ago in Sweden. But because of what I've mentioned, the role that we see in that value chain to ensure that the food gets delivered to the consumer so that it's affordable, it's safe, made it that very quickly we expanded our business to look into how you transform the raw materials, orange, dairy, into a product that you will consume. I like to use example saying, how many of the people in the room had a pizza in the past 2 weeks?
Pizza? Oh.
A lot? Okay. There's a high chance that the mozzarella that has been on the pizza has been processed on one of our machines, right? And if you have a baby and you're using a milk powder, there's a high chance that this powder came from one of the drying towers, so we transform dairy into powder, right? So that's the type of equipment that we have. It's unseen, and I like to call in a way our role, the role that Tetra Pak has as the hidden middle. We're in hidden in that value chain to enable that food transformation. Now, that's actually 30 to 40% of the value in the food systems. Which means that if you think about the solutions that we can provide by offering portfolio that reduces the use of energy, the use of water, reduces food loss and waste, actually you can have a big win. It's a low-hanging fruit. I keep on hearing during the Climate Week the hard-to-abate sectors. Well, food processing is not a hard-to-abate system. Solutions are there, but we need actually also a push from governments to enable that transition, to get the financing right, because only 4% of climate finance is dedicated to finance. We heard from Max, it's 30% of the climate footprint, 4% of the financing. So I think this is very important to keep that in mind, and that's the role that we want to have, being in this hidden middle, to engage with farmers, with brands like the PepsiCo and Danone of this world, to really put together a plan and to decarbonize our value chain. We've done it with our scope 1, 2, and 3, minus 20%, so we are way ahead of the target that we have for 2030. And that's our call to action. Solutions are there. We need courage, and we also need the help from government, especially the time that we are negotiating for COP29, what we call the NDCs, the National Determined Contribution. It's about time that countries step up and consider food into their engagement, because companies like Tetra Pak in this hidden middle have solutions.
Okay, a couple of things in here that I want to go to our other, I'm going to call you our food panelists. This notion of incorporating agriculture into a country's climate targets. Do you have thoughts on that? Sorry to put you on the spot with that, but it's irresistible. Max, what do you think?
Agriculture has to be a critical part of the solution for fighting climate change. I mean, as we've talked about, the way we feed ourselves globally accounts for anywhere between a quarter to a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. But what makes agriculture so unique is what we were talking about earlier. It's not only a contributor today to our greenhouse gas footprint globally, but it actually has the potential to be a solution. And so what we're working on with regenerative agriculture and finding ways to channel our R&D engines across seeds and traits, across small molecules, biologicals, digital services, is to do just that. Think about a reimagination and re-augmentation of the entire production system to turn climate on its head in the context of agriculture and have agriculture be a critical solution. So I think, to your question, Jeff, absolutely it needs to be a theme and topic that is considered in any conversation, whether it be in the private sector or across regulatory spaces here in the United States and globally.
Scott, thoughts on that, or just a ditto on Max there?
Yeah, no, I think it's really, really important too that we take a look at all the new technology coming to help support climate action too, and put the investment that can help accelerate us with different activities, whether it's breeding genetics to pull more CO2 out of the air and create a more dense, concentrated grain that can deliver more value with less land use is extremely important. There's other biotechnology and field applications in terms of monitoring carbon in the soil, using aerial imagery, using optical sensing to sense the health of a plant and let a plant communicate to different soil moisture meters, and turning on irrigation systems and managing resources. So I think we need to move that investment in there to help biotech companies and new inventors bring new technology to the industry, and we think agriculture has many, many solutions to come. I'm sitting right next to one as well.
Good point, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Thank you for your patience. But before we lose sight of it, there's something else Gilles mentioned that I want to get your input on, and that is this notion of food waste. Briefly, how are you looking at addressing that, and do you agree that it is that big of a problem?
Yeah, it definitely is that big of a problem. And I think the more that we can engage our consumers and understand their cooking habits, their eating habits, and portion size, we can help work together in terms of producing the appropriate packaging, right? The proper size to minimize the waste. And we need to work closer with our customers and bring the transparency on what we're doing in terms of climate action, bring it in packaging, bring it in food waste control as well.
And Max, thoughts on that?
I think Scott summarized it very well. As I've mentioned, our focus is upstream. It starts with the farmer. But at the end of the day, we can generate, I think, meaningful solutions that impact the environmental footprint of agri-food. But if we're not doing something about the challenge at the other end of the value chain in terms of the way that foods are processed and consumed, and also see that there's meaningful progress on reducing that waste, then we're not tackling the problem holistically. And when it comes to a challenge as big as climate and food security, we have to be thinking holistically. So I think Scott made some very, compelling points about how we need to do that.
Thank you so much. Itasha, thank you for your patience. Now, I'm sure you've been listening to a lot of this and thinking, well, I have an idea for how we might solve that. But begin with describing a bit more, for a lay audience, the technology that you've developed.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say it is such a pleasure to be on this panel and hear about all these companies that have really gotten to scale. I mean, think about, we're feeding the world, we're packaging that food, we're sending it off, and how much, you're basically engaging in a carbon cycle. And so, at 12, what we're looking to do is we're saying, can we make an industrial carbon cycle by basically mimicking the work that happens with trees and, with plants and farms. So, trees and plants will take carbon dioxide out of the air. They'll use sunlight and water and convert that CO2 into sugars and release oxygen. And those sugars become food for their own growth and development. And then, we enjoy those sugars in the forms of fruits and vegetables and so forth. And so at 12, we're looking to do that in an industrial context. We're saying, we can take CO2, water, and we use electricity, so renewable electricity from solar, wind, or even nuclear, any type of renewable form of electricity, to convert that CO2 and water into new molecules. And we also release oxygen as a byproduct as well. So we're really creating this cycle of utilizing CO2. And the way we want to go about it is in this for-profit company, because we want to work with much larger companies and embed within their supply chain and say, look, you can continue to grow, you can continue to leverage flight and shipping and so forth. But now my company and other companies in this ecosystem that we're creating will provide that sustainable fuel so that you can have those 200 passenger flights and those intercontinental cargo ships, and you can do it sustainably. So I'm really excited to exist in a world where we would have those options, where all of us can fly here and know that we had some sustainable aviation fuel in the plane that was carrying us here.
So talk to me a little more about where the CO2 comes from for your products.
Yeah, ultimately, from a technology perspective, we're agnostic to where we get the CO2. Now, from a policy, to leverage the federal and state incentives, we look for biogenic forms of CO2. So agriculture is one big place. So, when you're, digesting, say, manure from cows and so forth, you can produce CO2 in that process. We can take that CO2 and convert it into fuels. Corn ethanol is another process that emits CO2. Paper and pulp is another biogenic process that emits CO2. But ultimately, there's other industrial processes such as steel manufacturing, cement, so forth. So we could utilize that CO2. But right now, the policy is very much focused on biogenic forms of CO2.
So in jargony speak, it often gets shortened to CCS, carbon capture and storage. And properly, it's carbon capture, use, and storage, right? And so you're the missing U in that, right?
Yeah, we like to say carbon transformation because
transformation,
you can utilize CO2 without transforming it. And in fact, one of the biggest ways at scale that CO2 is utilized is with enhanced oil recovery. So we want to distinguish that we're not doing enhanced oil recovery. So we fundamentally change the molecule. Again, we are doing the work that trees and plants do of stripping down the CO2 into smaller atomic bits, using our metal catalyst and electricity to reform those atomic bits into new molecules. So our fuel that we make this Jet A blend, it is a drop-in replacement for fossil-based fuels. on a molecular atomic level, there's no main distinguishment factor from our fuels and the fuels that would go into a plane today. Now, regulatory reasons, we blend up to 50% of our fuel with petroleum to meet the regulatory requirement. But in the future, you could have planes that would be 100% with our fuel. And shipping, same thing. Diesel, we can make those fuels with our process.
Can you talk to me a little more about what the potential impact of that would be if we can flip over to sustainable fuels for those activities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about, in flight right now, we use about 9 billion gallons per year of jet fuel. And if, all of that can be made sustainably. And also, I want to say we make sustainable aviation fuel from CO2, but the largest sustainable aviation fuel made today is from agriculture right now. So there's both animal talent and biomass and so forth. So we are kind of looking to expand that market and capture that eventually 9 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel. But then if you look on the marine side, then you're looking at all the ships that go intercontinental and being able to ship your materials using this sustainable marine fuel. So, adding up all our transportation, in those sectors, you're getting in the up to 10% of our CO2 emissions can be attributed to, those forms of transportation. So, we could be a major player in that and be able to reduce those emissions drastically.
But wait, there's more. You're looking beyond fuels to other potential applications of this, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, in addition to the fuels, we make a naphtha blend. We call it e-naphtha. And naphtha is found in many different products. In fact, many of the products in this room are probably made from naphtha. So naphtha can be basically broken down into smaller molecules such as ethylene or propylene, made into plastics, made into other goods. So again, you're making plastics from CO2 instead of taking it from petroleum. You're making home goods. You're making all of these things from using CO2, water, and electricity.
Thank you. So in order to inject a technology like that into supply chains, in order to make them effective across supply chains, it's going to take a lot of cooperation, a lot of collaboration. I'm sure it's not easy to shift gears to do something like that. So I want to go down the line and talk a bit about how you see collaboration developing across your supply chains. And I'll start there at the far end with you, Max. We've touched on this before, but in your work with farmers, with companies like Scott's, what are the key things, key moments that make collaboration work when it comes to talking about emissions?
There are a few things that I think are critical to recognize when discussing the topic of collaboration across the ecosystem. And particularly in agri-food, these are supply chains that are capital intensive, they are well established, and they have significant scale. And so for us at Bayer, the way we think about it isn't how do we invent a new supply chain. It isn't how do we take what we have today and toss it out the window. It's instead, how do we identify across each link in the value chain, what are the complementarities that each organization brings to bear? And then how do we ultimately cohesively bring it together to get the most impact that we possibly can have? And so in the case of our partnership with Purdue, Bayer, our core competency is in how do we partner with farmers? How do we support them in making agronomic and operational decisions that are best for them and that can ultimately allow them to be productive, but also through the integration of regenerative farming, make a positive impact on the environment. Purdue, on the other hand, and Scott will speak to it better than I, but one of the reasons why we're so excited to partner with them is because they have this integrated supply chain that connects all the way to the growers that are raising that grain that they buy to the foods that they manufacture and get to the retail shelf. And so that's a case where we're bringing our core competencies in agronomy and research and development to the farm gate, and then aligning those with the core competencies of an organization like Purdue that has this world-class, highly concentrated, integrated supply chain. So I think that's the key, Jeff. Like, you have to look across each application, each product, and each project that you're trying to stand up and figure out what are the respective strengths that each organization can bring to the table to facilitate effective collaboration?
David, can you think of an example where it really clicked with your supply chain partners and you were collaborating?
Well, we are working, we have a regenerative organic farm in our factory that does research. Many years ago, one man in Italy, kind of a visionary, to counteract the phenomenon of fast food in America, created a movement called slow food. And slow food was all based about biodiversity, was based about enriching with diversity of cultivars, different cultivations. And in fact, we started a long time ago to cooperate with farmers on specific cultivars that are maybe at risk of extinction, with the specific farmers that were like dedicated to keep alive, because the more biodiversity you have in the world, and the more you have rich nutrients, you have a food chain that is more qualitative. It's good to talk about efficiency because, of course, we need to feed 10 billion people. But I think not at the detriment of quality. It's good also to have food that doesn't make you sick, but food that is healthy. And therefore, we collaborate with Rodel Institute that since 8 years is educating farmers in America about regenerative organic practices with demonstrative farms in these countries: Pennsylvania, Georgia, California, Washington State, Iowa. We also have a Rodel regenerative organic farm in Italy. And what we do, we collaborate also with many big European food companies, and we offer services, scientific services in matching conventional agriculture with regenerative organic agriculture, and see and compare when it comes to the yield, when it comes to the quality of food. Because we want to offer and we want to demonstrate, and there are like our agri-scientists can demonstrate that and can collaborate, that regenerative organic agriculture not necessarily reduces the yield, reduces the efficiency, but instead offers a higher quality product, a product that offers better environmental ecosystems. Because we've seen that today, agriculture and animal farming represent 25-30% of the total CO2 emissions. It's as impactful as industry, and it shouldn't be like that. So when I talk about this with my mom, and because my grandparents were farmers, and I told them, we are collaborating with this company, we are doing this, and we are doing all these cover crops, very little till, and also crop rotation. She said, oh, really? I mean, you discover warm water. This is what our grandparents were doing. So you didn't invent nothing new. But you remember that sometimes in the past we had that taste that today food don't taste like this anymore. Also Italy, because it's like in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea with a lot of wind left and right, has a lot of biodiversity. So we think it's very important. And so sometimes when you dedicate everything to efficiency, productivity, because we just have to feed 10 billion people, you forget about. I think you make maybe the nature and the ecosystem less resilient, more poor, and maybe even less healthy.
Good points there. Resilience is, I think, an overlooked factor that we need to keep in mind as we encounter more climate impacts. So thank you for bringing that up. But I want to keep to our line of questioning here with collaborative examples. When you work with your folks in your supply chain, how does that work? Do you find collaboration, Gilles, sorry. How do you see, share an example of when that really worked for you?
So actually 4 years ago, we launched the Tetra Pak Join Us in Protecting the Planet initiative with our suppliers. It was originally meant to focus on climate, and it was supposed to be a forum where we could exchange best practices, but also nurture innovation. A few examples that I have in mind that came out of that initiative. We've recently launched a paper-based barrier that helps to protect food. I would say with the same level of food safety than a plastic/aluminum barrier. So that's one exciting example. But we've also used that space beyond collaboration. I've mentioned that Tetra Pak is in the hidden middle. And when you think of the value chain, so it's links together, right? But we are a very strong link because of our presence in 180 countries and our 70 years of experience. What it means that we have a responsibility to onboard our suppliers. And that's why you have, okay, carrots and sticks. Carrots, innovation. We will always value innovation. We've always pushed innovation, especially when it comes to better environmental footprint. But we've also allowed ourselves to establish some sticks, nice sticks, within that initiative, which now we have, by the way, expanded to water and biodiversity. We are now actually forcing our suppliers, it's part of the suppliers' code of conduct. They have to set targets, which means that they have to measure their impact. They need to be part of SBTi, they have to measure their impact. We are onboarding them to do the same on nature. We are part of SBTN, the Science-Based Target for Nature, because we need to ensure that our suppliers know very well their impact, because talking about resilience, if they don't know their impact, then I think they're exposed to massive risk, which means that our business is exposed to risk. So call it stick or call it engagement and collaboration, but we don't shy away from pushing our suppliers to step up, measure, take targets, that's step one. And then actually we track actions that sometimes we can make together. So a good example is land restoration in Brazil. We are working with our paper suppliers in Brazil to restore a massive piece of land in the Atlantic forest. And that's a great positive example that we are doing alongside, I would say, some sticks. So it's carrots, sticks, engagement. But we can do this because we are big. And I think that's the role of the big companies. We don't want them to shy away. We are not shying away. Everyone should act like this.
It sounds like it's a mix of being friendly but firm.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Scott, I'm looking for specifics, because we've talked about the role of collaboration and your partnership here. So I'm wondering, like, specific examples of how you see farmers collaborating.
Yeah, really great question too. And it's important to listen, right, and learn and educate each other together, especially from the farmer to the consumer. So we have to listen to our farmers. We have to make data collection easy, verification, help them with the conversion of the practices, but we also have to listen to our business-to-business customers and our consumers and educate them on climate action as well. You know, our CEO, Kevin McAdams, is pushing Raise a Better Future, right? It's Raise a Better Future for our associates, for our farmers, for our animals, and for our consumers. And I think everybody in this room has a role in climate action. Everybody can take action and be responsible for an intervention moving forward. And I think being able to listen and educate and learn and share those learnings transparently through the supply chain. And that's what our customers are asking for. We want to see it.
Interesting point.
That's what we want to share.
So I'm going to put a pin in that. I want to return to this notion of how you interact with consumers. So make note, we'll return to that point. But on the role of collaboration, how does that play out for you?
Yeah, I mean, we basically will survive as a company through our collaboration. So we are looking to build these very large plants that will make fuels and naphtha. So we need to, one, have a customer have an offtake that will take our molecules and use them to make materials. So we've announced partnerships on the fuel side with Alaska Airlines and Microsoft as well. So again, a Scope 1 and a Scope 3 partnership. So they were collaborating and then they collaborated with us. So a little collaboration there. We also announced a partnership with IAG, which is the parent company of British Airways. So we had that collaboration. We have some collaborations that are in the works for our naphtha for consumer products. So again, we would be working with the end user as well as the manufacturer of that material to form a tri-collaboration as well there to make sure that our materials are being used and as drop-in replacements for these existing materials, but also that the end user is aware that they're purchasing lower carbon materials. And then collaboration to deploy our systems. Like we have technical collaborators, so we're one step in a two-step process, and we've been licensing that technology and bringing it to bear and working with EPC firms to build our first plant. So in a lot of ways, the infrastructure that we've built in this country and the infrastructure we'll continue to build has been built through partnerships and collaborating in those partnerships. And so we're just looking to repeat that for this new industry.
It's a good point. I mean, to the earlier point about, what was it, reinventing water or something like that? Yeah, it's we're sort of discovering new applications of old things here. So thank you for that. I wanted to return to this notion of how we deal with or how you deal with your consumers. And David, since I think you brought this up first, I'll go to you to respond to this. Do you find that the products that you're bringing to market, and you're very proud of the sustainable profile of this product, are those the winners in the marketplace necessarily, and how does that go?
Well, we learned the hard way that sometimes when we get too excited about sustainability, and we reduce the performance of the product, the consumer doesn't buy into it and checks out. So all our R&D goes, and our reason to exist and to create products is to get at the best crossroad between the performance, so the delivering on the expected result or the promise that you make to consumer, and the sustainability practice. So we have a decent bunch of scientists, a small but a strong scientific community in our different labs. By the way, the last one is a green chemistry lab that we put together. And we use green chemistry through natural extractions to turn around our supply chain. But having said that, we always have to look at both dimensions, the performance and the sustainability at the same time. We are not shy sometimes in asking our chemists to work for 1 year just to take out a chemical ingredient and to substitute it with a green chemistry one. I remember when I started I'm a chemist, when I started as a product development chemist, we were all excited when we could add a new polymer, a new synthetic breakthrough inside the formula. Now it's exactly the opposite. We're excited where we can take it out. Sometimes it takes 1 year to take out one. But then the quality of the product stays there, and when you have a better footprint, the consumers start to understand. But the result, the quality of the performance has to be there.
Is that the main barrier when a product like this doesn't exactly click with consumers? Is it generally because price point, or is it because it's not the product they expect?
No, I don't think it's price point. There are, for example, in the beauty industry, there are all different price points. It's really about delivery on the result. Then it's also true that in the beauty industry, sometimes there are lots of gray areas, lots of claims that are a bit up in the air, and we realize in our test that it's very difficult for consumers to be objective. So when we do instrumental test and we consider then the subjective response, we find a mixed match between the objectivity and the subjectivity of specific formula. So we need to live with that. But as a company, we have the strength of our company is our purpose, our scope of being in business to do our best for the world through by offering a good life to all our stakeholders, because we are not a shareholder company, we are a stakeholder company, through beauty, ethics, and sustainability. So we have a strong company purpose, and through this strong company purpose, we know what we have to do when it comes to the formulas, because we want to deliver on the purpose.
And Scott, you mentioned the importance of interacting with consumers and some consumer education, perhaps. Tell me more about that and how it pertains to trying to advance sustainability and bring down emissions.
Yeah, and really educating that consumer. And we're a 104-year-old company with a research and development, actually building and group of individuals, talented individuals that hold focus groups, they talk to consumers, they try to understand what moves a consumer to purchase a product, right? And so if you take a look at price and texture and taste, animal care, as well as sustainability, they're sort of the top 5. And so understanding what your consumer wants, showing them your activity in climate action and what you're doing to build a better product is really important. And we think that's an essential component to expanding climate action as well.
Thank you. And Gilles, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, Tetra Pak is a B2B company, but at the end of the day, we have to know the consumer, the citizens, to better design our product and be there with our customers, the food manufacturers, so that they can provide the right product. We are doing every second year what we call a consumer index. So it's a wide study on more than 60 countries where we try to understand what are the consumer trends, products, expectations, sustainability. Of course, when we ask consumers the questions, do you want to buy a more sustainable product? You will get a yes for 95+% of the people. Then comes the question of the translation into the Retail Act, which maybe in beauty there's more margin and you can afford that. I think in the world of food, it's unfortunately a low margin business where people are going for price primarily. This being said, we've seen a shift in the past 10 years in recognition, willingness to buy more, and a shift in some of the purchase that have been done. We see that trend typically in dairy, where plant-based drinks/milk have grown steadily. It's never going to replace in the short term. That's also the truth. But it has grown because of health benefits and climate benefits. Also because some of those brands have done heavy communication. So I'm now turning to the last piece of what I wanted to say. I think there's a responsibility of companies to explain clearly the value in terms of additional benefits for the consumers, which is not necessarily climate. Climate is unfortunately something that is in the air. It's hard to touch, even if we feel the consequences. But if you start to talk about health, actually, if you start to talk about nature, the soil, that's where you have a strong connection. So that link between climate and nature and the soil and nature is what gets you connected to the consumers. And we start to see many brands in the world of food that are getting back to that roots with a positive, I would say, impact in consumers' behavior. So that's also something that we are, in a way, pushing on our sides through our technology and our know-how with the consumers.
In beauty, they say that a consumer can afford to pay up to 10% more for a sustainable product. Above 10%, it gets a little bit more critical.
So that's the rule of thumb, basically. Yes. And a really good point, too, and I think we see a parallel to this in politics about how climate as a concept is still pretty abstract for a lot of consumers, a lot of voters, but focusing on these what you would call co-benefits or other additional factors that come along with climate action, it kind of becomes a no-brainer and an easier sell, I'm guessing. Do you see that is the case?
I mean, I think it's the case. I think it's a responsibility for companies that are actually all relying on nature-based raw materials, whether it be for cosmetics or food. So I think, yes, it's a responsibility to also bring back consumers, decision makers, policy makers on the reality of what you've described. Earth is a breathing system. So we need to reconnect to the origin of the raw materials and to protect that, because that's where you have the biggest potential in terms of climate mitigation as well. So yeah.
So I have another question for the panel as a whole, and heads up, Max, I'm going to come to you first, and then come down the road.
I've gotten used to it. Glad I'm here.
So the old saw is what? You can't really manage what you don't really measure, right? So let's talk a bit about how you measure these things, not just the emissions, but the benefits you're getting. How do you capture that? We touched on this earlier in our other conversation, but give me an example of how that plays out and how you wrestle down something that is difficult to measure but important to demonstrate empirically.
If you listen to the comments that were just made among the other panelists about the importance of consumer education and how we ultimately communicate messages relating to climate action or biodiversity or water quality and savings, there needs to be a clear communication, but there has to be credibility, right? There needs to be belief in the fact that the brand that you're aligning with, that you're choosing to invest your hard-earned dollars with, is really aligning with your values and not just projecting an image of doing good. And so for us, as we think about how to construct a business model that can ultimately enable and serve those end-use markets through partners like Purdue or other customers of ours across the ecosystem, we invest aggressively in making sure that we have the most rigorous approach to how we collect and manage data, how we ultimately secure evidence from farmers relating to interventions, and then how we process all of that data and evidence together using industry-leading biogeochemical process models, which that's a big term, but models that actually can take the data and then analyze them and represent a specific impact on the carbon dynamics of the ecosystem, either in increasing emissions or lowering them, or even producing, as we've talked a lot about, biogenic removals, so taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it to the soil. And so I think the key thing here to recognize, Jeff, is we need to be following the most rigorous, peer-reviewed standards that are out there. And great organizations like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or Science-Based Target, or even obviously the work that the IPCC is doing, is I think providing that framework within which we can operate to ensure that we are bringing the most rigorous approach to generating these carbon benefits, because that's ultimately what's going to serve as the foundation for making credible claims that will then support compelling messages that can ultimately connect with the hearts and the minds of consumers that want to buy aligned with their values.
Super, thank you. David, same question to you. How do you go about measuring what's really going on with trying to cut emissions?
Well, as I said before, almost 10 years as part of the B Corp movement. B Corp's 8,000 companies in the world, all under like a measurement. And when you are below 80, it means that you extract more than what you give. When you're above 80, you give more than what you take. We even created a Regenerative Society Foundation to measure multidimensionally the regenerative potential of every single project, not companies. You can measure a project and see how regenerative it is when it comes to those 5 dimensions: circularity, natural capital, exemplarity, or educational potential. So for every single project, you have a different regenerative index. When it comes to, for example, our regenerative organic farm, we do measure the soil, and we do measure the CO2 capture, the amount of microorganism, even of the, I don't know how you call it in English, the little worms. Yeah.
The worms.
So we have a very rigorous system of measuring and comparing versus the conventional agriculture, the richness of the soil. So yeah, measurement, of course, it's super important on every single thing. We are also SBTI. We use these scientific methods. And so, yeah.
Gilles, same question. How are you approaching this?
Yeah, I mean, I really recognize the work that Tetra Pak does into what Davide, you just said, and Max. Tetra Pak has actually been measuring its environmental footprint since the early 1990s. We've issued our first Scope 1 and 2 report in 2005, and we were one of the first companies to have SBTI verified target back in 2017, covering Scope 3. So we are all in using the best-in-class scientific rigorous measurements that exist out there. Good news, they exist. Greenhouse Gas Protocol is not new. The same thing is happening on nature. SBT and Science-Based Target for Nature has issued great, actually, guidance on how to measure and prioritize your nature impact. So we can't hide behind the fact that there are those rigorous methods out there. Unfortunately or fortunately, depends on how you see it, there's actually thousands of companies that are SBTi verified target. It's 40% of the global GDP. So it's positive 40%, we still have to convince 60%. The good news with that type of data and standardized data is that you can actually start to make the link as well with the scope 3, because you also engage into what is reporting. There's, I think, lots of noise around reporting. Europe has started with CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is keeping many of the companies out there busy. We start to see ISSB being kind of actually confirmed by many markets around the world. It's sustainability standards for reporting. Why do I mention that? Because, okay, for companies, it's a work to do. We have to report like we are doing for financing. I hear a lot that it's a pain. It is a complex process to start with, but data is fantastic to use because it will help you to make decisions where you have an impact. And actually, if you have the right data, you become valuable for your customers or even your suppliers. I'm getting calls from my food manufacturers every day because they need my data. And because I have it, actually they consider me in their preferred set of suppliers. So it becomes a competitive advantage in the short term, because in 5 years everyone will have to report, but in the short term, I'm using that as an advantage. So yes, it starts with science-based, rigorous data. We have to report. Let's start now, because it can be a competitive advantage.
Very good.
To measure the difference, the different impact of, for example, conventional agriculture versus regenerative organic agriculture, it takes years. So we have projects that are, we have different plots, 100 of different plots where we cultivate with different practices, and then we compare data, and usually it takes 3 to 5 years to really have some solid data.
You've got to consider that time lag before it's going to be like reportable, accountable, et cetera. And just quickly to your point on the role of emerging regulation, I mean, it's also an issue in the United States. The Securities and Exchange Commission considered Scope 3 emissions and their disclosure requirements, quickly realized, I think, that they had kicked a hornet's nest. It generated the most comments in SEC history, and they backed away from that. However, California is moving ahead, and so I think what you all are doing is sort of laying the groundwork in a lot of ways for other companies that if they're not already addressing this, they're going to have to.
Yeah, but guess what? China is doing it.
Yes.
China is going Scope 3, Singapore is going Scope 3, Australia is going Scope 3. So it's just a matter of time. We have to respect the policy timeline in every country, but it's coming also for, again, business needs. Because when you measure Scope 3, you understand your impact, you understand your risk. And as companies, climate is a risk, it should be an opportunity. So that's where Scope 3 kicks in. So really let's change our mindset on thinking about Scope 3 as an opportunity.
Very good. Scott, thoughts on measuring?
Yeah, these gentlemen have just summed it up really, really well. But the other thing that I would recommend is really starting small too, and taking a look at your product footprint, right? From, let's take low carbon oil or low carbon chicken. We're footprinting both of those products right now. And so we've broke it down into buckets. So we're taking a look at that regenerative farm practicing and the data associated with that. Our elevators are Scope 1s and Scope 2s in terms of holding grain, drying grain, our crush facilities, our refining facilities, our feed mills, all the way through processing chicken and then ultimately the consumer. And once you have that data, it'll give you a baseline that you can compare against other life cycle analyses and other databases that are out there. And then you can start to determine where the hot spots are within your value chain and then be able to address them just as you gentlemen have just stated, because our customers want our information as well, because it's a component of what they're producing. So start small, measure, get yourself a baseline, understand where you're standing, and then evaluate what carbon or climate interventions you can then implement. And then I think you guys summed it up well.
And Itasha, I know this is enormously important to your applying your technology, but what's an example of how, I don't know, give me an example of something that was really difficult to nail down and measure.
Yeah, well, first I'll say, like, the ethos of our company when we first got started was that, you know, we can grow the economy and be green. We can support supply chain growth and be sustainable. So, and we wanted to enable the technology, or one of the technologies that would make that possible. And so in a lot of ways, we can use traditional economic metrics to understand our impact in kind of greenhouse gas emissions. But we also too, as we get to scale and get to a full operability, we also realize that, we are working with partners who, we also want to make sure they have supply chains that are becoming more green, and where we're buying components that have greenhouse gas emissions that are tracked. And so one way in which we were able to do this was with our EPC firms that we were looking. So we put out bids to get firms to design our first plant that we're building up in Moses Lake in Washington. And we realized that those firms weren't necessarily used to thinking about the life cycle analysis of the plant that they were building. They might, an engineer might think about, like, how do I reduce the cost, or how do I get the schedule right? Reduce the schedule. But they often don't think about, how do I improve the carbon intensity score of the ultimate product, or how do I think about the life cycle analysis? So we had to make as simple as possible, a kind of a spreadsheet and say, like, these are the inputs that we care about. We need to know what these inputs are as you make this design. And then we will, do the back-end calculation to understand what the CI score is. Mm-hmm. So that designing for carbon intensity score is one thing where we really had to kind of start that conversation and build that very simple, as simplify, clarify as much as possible how to track that.
And all of that adds to a point that someone made here, maybe Max, the notion of adding credibility to the claims is so important. And I think that's the antidote to the corrosive effect of greenwashing, is to say, no, we've got the numbers, we've got the data. And related to that, the transparency and the disclosure that will come with the regulation. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Thank you all so much. And I want to wrap up here, though, by pulling away from some of the weedy details that we've been diving into and talk a bit about hope. Hope is an essential ingredient that I think is often overlooked. In your company, in your business, in the sector that you're hoping to influence, what gives you hope?
Well, I think back to some of the early days of aviation. Can you imagine being at Kitty Hawk and, you're flying your first flight and you're saying, like, wow, what an amazing thing. And think about how small of a step that was to now that we're at full scale. We fly, I'm not even sure what it is, maybe 200,000, 200 passenger planes per day on Earth. That's incredible. And, that took some time, and it's, this is a long game, but I see that we've scaled many things. We've solved many planetary problems before, and we can do it again. When we think about, we took lead out of gasoline planetary wide. The hole in the ozone is shrinking to, my recollection in 2021, it was almost approximately closed, or some moments it had closed, and it's kind of a, well, I'm not a
we got it mostly whipped.
Yeah. We worked together as a planet to really work on that and bring down those emissions that were causing that hole in the ozone. So I think we can do it again. And we're here. We're different companies at different scales, different industry. We're all focused on that same mission. And humans have focused on missions before in the past, and we've succeeded. And so we'll do it again.
Very good, Scott. Same question.
Yeah, Emmanuel said it in the fireside chat, I believe, right? Let climate action be contagious. And that's awesome. I mean, let it drive efficiencies within your business. Let it incentivize new biotech and new techniques to bring climate back under control. And I think that's the exciting part, and that gives me hope as well. So thank you, Emmanuel.
Excellent. Gilles, where do you see hope?
Yeah, well, I see hope every day because, fortunately enough, at Tetra Pak, we are decarbonizing heavily. We are continuing to grow from a net sales perspective, money perspective, but we've done that minus 20% scope 1, 2, and 3 in 4 years. So that's contagious. That's contagious across our value chain. That's contagious internally because now we get the business excited because they see that they can grow their net sales, decarbonize, so decarbonize heavily. So that's exciting. That contagious piece is also touching people. I never received as many CVs, resumes from people internally and people externally that are willing to join our company. And I think that's also part of the company's valuation, the ability to attract talents, because we need talent to drive that transformation. So that's contagious in a positive way, is what keeps me very excited.
And David?
Well, in this moment, there are a lot of signs that go against evidence, but hope is in science. Hope is in the possibility through our effort and commitment to decouple the growth. Hope is in the new generations, big time, because new generations of consumers are extremely more sensitive, and so I think new generation will drive. If you look at every single generation, the ecosystem degraded big time. I remember that, for example, I don't know, my father was taking a bath in a river in north of Italy that today nobody takes a bath anymore. So, things like that. So in every new generation there is degradation of the biophilia, the relationship between man and nature. So I think new generation will make the difference.
Thank you. Max, last word. Hope.
The thing that gives me hope is frankly the farmers. I told a story earlier in our fireside chat about that grower who has instituted cover crop, no tillage, has focused on cultivating their soil health, and just the level of productivity resilience they've had in that operation. And the reason why that's so important is y'all could be a group of farmers, and I could talk up here until I'm blue in the face about why you should go on this journey of regenerative agriculture. I'm never going to be as persuasive as that grower who is down the road having that type of success will be. And so by seeing growers that are coming along in this journey, are having success, and they're serving as influencers and standard bearers in their local communities, just gives me the greatest degree of optimism and excitement about where the space is going.
Super. I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give our panelists a warm round of applause. Thank you so much.
Welcome back to the stage, Emmanuel Abbat, Cytiva.
Oh, we're gonna have some Q&A, so stay seated. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I warmed up the seat for you. So we have some time for questions from the audience, and I know this audience reflects quite a bit of expertise, and so I hope we're going to have some good questions. We have a couple of folks who are going to have microphones ready for us, and who's going to give our first question for this lovely panel? In the back there?
Hello, my name is Anna Larson. I work with the World Shipping Council, so representing container carriers, vehicle carriers internationally, Scope 3 emissions for most of you. Very excited to hear from Dr. Cave about the progress on the green fuels. 70% of the new vessels to be built by 2028 could run on your fuels. Now, our big challenge is getting access to enough fuel at a reasonable cost. So my question to you is, what do you need? What would really help you scale quickly and your colleagues in your business so we can help you?
Yeah, really appreciate that question and glad to have you in the audience. We definitely think about cost at scale, and we have a roadmap to be at fossil parity at scale once we've scaled our technology and perfected our performance. Right now, we can be at cost parity, but we definitely need those Scope 3 premiums. We need the state and federal incentives to cover the difference. And so what we really need is to be able to bring in those tri-partnerships. So having that offtake agreement from someone who's saying like, yes, we will take this fuel, and we'll work with you to tier out those purchases and accept that fuel at a rate at which we can produce it, and then we can take that to a financier that understands that we're still within our first 10 plants, not even just we're certainly building our first of a kind plant now, but even the second, third, and so on plants will still be on the cost curve and coming down it. So we'll be able to go to those financiers and bring in that funding. And then we also still need to do some work on the technology side. You're absolutely right that there is a greater demand than there is supply right now for sustainable aviation fuel, sustainable marine fuel across the board. And so in a lot of ways it's going to take some time, but we've seen, again, as other industries that have scaled up, once you hit that inflection point where you're starting to deploy and others come along, then you can really just build out an industry. So, those three prongs of the technology, financing, and offtake. And so someone in your position, certainly having those offtake agreements that can be patient, that can be willing to pay a bit of a premium early on and say like, hey, we want to build this relationship and work with you as you come down the cost curve. Those are the really key, the golden moments that can help us get to where we need to go.
Thank you. Other questions? No? Yes. In the front row, yes.
Hi, I'm Dimitra from the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and I have a question for Dr. Tasha. You mentioned briefly about a facility in Washington, and I was just curious if you could speak maybe more to a current scale of operations or a timeline on that, and current operating facilities, if any.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're building our first fully operable plant. So it'll convert CO2 into carbon monoxide and hydrogen. So we have a water electrolyzer that makes hydrogen as well. And then we use a Fischer-Tropsch process to then make a hydrocarbon blend. So most of that hydrocarbon blend becomes jet fuel. And then we have 20% that becomes naphtha. Now the jet fuel, that gets blended with, again, because we can only blend up to 50% per regulation for our jet fuel. So that then goes to an airport terminal. And then the naphtha would go to be further refined and made into plastics and polymers. So our first plant at full capacity will produce about 200 gallons per day. And so we are currently building that site. And so we broke ground last year. And depending on where your optimism lies, look forward to sometime in the next year to be able to have our fuels on a flight somewhere. But again, many miles to go before we get to that flight. So we have to build our plant, make the fuel, certify it, send it to our customers, and so forth.
Thank you. And now we have a lot of hands. There was someone else in this neighborhood. Oh, I'm sorry, back row. Thank you.
Hi, I'm with Carbios, a French company that has developed an enzyme technology to break down PET and PLA, and we're exploring other polymers at the moment. And looking across the US and also many countries, the recycling rates are diverge quite dramatically. Texas versus California, the US or versus Europe. So I'm curious for anyone who would like to take the question, kind of what you think your role is and your contribution can be in improving collection rates and ultimately driving recycling, because in many cases the technology exists, but collecting this waste and processing it, getting it ready for feedstock is still a key challenge.
Gilles, I'm tempted to go your way with this.
I'm happy to take it. Actually, if you look at the US that you've mentioned and beverage cartons that we produce, we know that in the US you have pretty much 62% of the household that have access to a collection system. So we're already missing 40% from the collection system. That's a big miss. So you collect, you sort, very important. Then you recycle, and that's why we have many technologies out there. You were mentioning yours from Carbios. There are many, many different technologies out there. And one of the challenges indeed is not necessarily to have the technology in place. Actually, there are capacity. If we look at beverage cartons, there's, when it comes to paper, 6 or 7 actually paper mills. There's a factory which is being built right now to recycle the plastic part and the aluminum part of our package. So the capacity is getting there. So one of the challenges is indeed to get the package being collected. I will come back to what I've mentioned with the UN Plastic Treaty, in which one of the key points of negotiation still is EPR, this extended producer responsibility, to be able to create the right collection scheme. I think countries have a responsibility to also look into what works well in other markets, right? The collection rate of beverage carton in Belgium is 90%, 9-0. The little ones that we miss are unfortunately in Horeca and are just dropped in the wrong bin. So there's a system which is highly efficient. If you go to France where you live, it's 70%, so you go down. US, 60%. So there's a responsibility from every player in the value chain. I think we're missing brands that also have a role to play, and retailer in engaging the policymakers. But one of the key advice that I would say, share at Tetra Pak alongside the Carton Council here in the US is really to ensure that all package types are part of EPR, because then the sorting center and the recyclers are happy to get that materials, because that materials equals value. There's value in recycling, which we need to repeat. So I think the policymakers have to take care of looking at best cases, and EPR is one way to work out on that system.
And I think we have time for one.
Just add
yes.
maybe one, and
Absolutely.
turn back sort of a comment and a question. I think it's in our case, collecting is easy because it's very concentrated. It's actually treated as biohazard, so we know where those plastic wastes are. The challenge for us is they're very complex, multi-layers plastic, and we haven't found the enzymatic solution that actually can help us get rid of this. So I think that's probably could be an after-during discussion with Carbios to see if you guys how you guys are looking at this. Really tackling the complex ones, right? Yeah.
Very good, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and we'll go to the front row. Here comes your microphone.
Thank you very much. Álvaro Valencia from the Human Impacts Institute. We use creative communications, arts, and culture to change human behavior. I was wondering, Max, if you are using creative communications for farmers to adopt regenerative agriculture. If so, what kind of strategies are you implementing?
Well, for us, it first and foremost starts at how are we showing up at the turn row to provide meaningful collaboration and support to growers. As I mentioned, the decision to take on a regenerative farming practice, it's not happening in a vacuum, right? There are all of these considerations in the context of agronomic variables that farmer has to manage if they're going to successfully transition. And so for us, it's about, do you have people locally in a market who's a trusted support system or collaborator with the farmer to really work with them in partnership to take on this challenge of managing successfully the integration of regenerative farming. There's just no replacement for trusted support and people that are working directly with growers. Agriculture, it's a relationships business, and so that's where our emphasis predominantly resides. As it relates to the ways in which we can be creative, there's a variety of things that we're doing in terms of multimedia outreach and communication, bulletins, timely newsletters about when a farmer may be deciding how or when they're going to terminate their cover crop, and there's just some things that we're doing there. But as it relates to continuing to evolve and strengthen the content and the messaging and the style, I'm sure there's an opportunity there. So would love to talk more about it.
Well, thank you all so much for your questions. And again, join me with a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Thank you all so much.